Welcome to Really This Week in History for Saturday, March 6, 2021. This week, I welcome Dr. Martin Lewis Johnson to discuss Disney CEO Bob Chapek's comments that there is no going back to the pre-COVID theater model. But before we get started, let me remind you that the website for the podcast is rtwihistory.com, and you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at RTWI History. Also contribute to the podcast by visiting patreon.com/RTWI History. Making news this week, Disney CEO Bob Chapek said that there is no going back to the traditional theater model after the straight-to-streaming release schedule championed by his own company and Warner Media. With Zack Snyder's Justice League and Godzilla vs. Kong releasing this month on HBO, the first 2021 blockbusters won't be chasing $250 million in their opening weekend box office, but will instead be measured by streams and new subscriptions. With me to discuss the current, past, and future states of the American theater is Dr. Martin Lewis Johnson, assistant professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and author of Main Street Movies, The History of Local Film in the United States. Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for joining me.
Great, and thank you for having me.
So what were your initial thoughts when you heard or saw Bob Chapek's comments, and what exactly is the current state of the American theater?
Yeah, I think that we've seen this kind of pessimism throughout the industry. So over the history of the industry, you see going back to the 1910s, people worried that filmmakers are making too many films and they're not going to be able to keep up and come up with new stories. You see stories in the 1930s and 40s worried that moviegoing has become too cheap or too commonplace. You see concerns in the 1960s that television is going to replace moviegoing. And this is, again, this kind of pessimism you find throughout. And somehow the industry manages to kind of find a way to continue to stay in business. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but I think the pessimism is not surprising given the kind of history of movie executives and their thoughts on the state of the industry.
Absolutely, certainly. Now, like I mentioned, and like you kind of mentioned as well, a lot of people are seeing some writing on the wall that scares traditional moviegoers and certainly scares theater chains and local theaters. But how has the relationship between theaters, moviegoers, being the studios, as well as movie creators, and moviegoers changed over the years and decades? And have there been scares like this, if not this drastic, in the past?
So I think there have been scares like this. Again, the various pandemics and epidemics have been fairly kind of hazardous. You've seen, of course, the 1918 flu closed theaters for many months. You had smaller kind of breakouts that closed theaters. And you also have kind of moments of crisis. The Great Depression, lots of theaters shut down. During World War II, you had some kind of restriction in kind of movie going. But I think what's a little bit different this time is just the duration of shutting theaters. This is a fairly long time for them to be shut down. And it's happening in a moment in which theaters are themselves in a fairly weak position. They've kind of lost stature compared to the producers. And I think particularly the kind of rise of streaming has given producers another outlet. They don't need the movie theaters to make money, which is, I think, partly why Disney and HBO Max are kind of considering this alternative kind of approach.
And you published Main Street Movies in 2018, not just about the theaters, but also about movie makers. What was it that led you to do that research and to put that book out on a topic that wasn't as widely discussed or studied?
Yeah, so I think part of it comes from just I've always been interested in film and kind of as a kind of film fan as a kid growing up. And when you study the history of cinema, the story you get is there are a handful of merchants in New York who discover that it's possible to make a lot of money charging people to see films. They bring in films from Europe and some from the US and elsewhere. And then they go on to start film companies. And so that's Warner Brothers, that's Paramount, that's MGM. And the story then goes that once the industry moves to Los Angeles, essentially there's one place where all the movies are made, and then there's thousands of places where movies are seen. And when I was first kind of in graduate school, kind of thinking about film history, I came across some information about these filmmakers that were actually making films all over the country and showing them to people in the movie theaters. And so to find this moment in which people were showing films publicly and audiences were able to see themselves on screen rather than images of movie stars in distant locations. So that I think was really exciting and kind of upended a lot of what I kind of knew about film history, and also kind of offered another story. I started working this project early in the kind of when YouTube was just emerging. And so it seemed, oh, here's this continuity. People are using moving images in a way now that they actually wanted to, and in some cases were in the 1930s, 40s, 50s.
So yeah, we have a million different technologies now, podcasting being one of them, where pretty much anybody can be a creator and gain an audience. TikTok is everybody's flipping through TikTok as they go to sleep, and hopefully not too much blue light is keeping them up. But is there harm in the amount of, or the ease of creation of this kind of media, in your opinion?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I tend to be, again, that's something else where you read moments in the past in which there's media panics that people are watching too many movies or kind of overly kind of invested in kind of in the fictional worlds of Hollywood. And I think that we live in a culture that's increasingly mediated, and the fact that we can make images, consume images, kind of participate in a moving image culture is just another kind of step. Like we spend more time with moving images and with screens than we do sleeping. And so I guess for some that might be very bad. For someone who teaches film classes and really wants, to have students who are really excited about what they see on those screens, it's a welcome development for me.
Awesome. So we know where we've been. We generally have an idea of where we are and where we're going in the immediate future. But where are we going? And as we look back, how important is the COVID-19 pandemic and the theater shutdown in the ultimate story of 21st century, not just theater, but moving image entertainment?
Yeah. So I think a couple of things. If you pull back a bit and think of the big picture of the last, say, decade or so, it's really the kind of rise of streaming. And streaming, again, begins to like around 2008, 2010, when it becomes first popular. And I think we've seen with 2020, both the arrival of some new streaming services, Disney Plus came out just before the pandemic. And also we've been able to have to rely on them for everything, not just select films or select television shows, but most of our kind of viewing has been through these streaming services. So I think that kind of opens up the questions about the relationship the streaming services have to their audiences. We've long since kind of moved away from thinking of audiences as being plural, and now it's often the audience or the single person watching. And so we might see more kind of customized content, I think, which could be interesting. So imagining, you sit down and, say, well, I'm really interested in watching a crime show, and somehow the AI knows what kind of crime show you like, anticipates like when you're going to go to bed. And so tailors a kind of a show that's going to be that particular length, and is able to kind of give you a show that's really your own story. Like it's individualized for you, maybe taking some components that have been pre-filmed elsewhere, but delivering a plot that's going to leave you satisfied and kind of make an experience that's worthwhile. So I think that's one, possible kind of trajectory. But you could equally see a kind of a different trajectory in which we realize in this streaming period that streaming is more like television, and that is really geared towards shorter, pieces of film. And if we're going to see a big show, we want to see it in a theater. And you might even see some producers out there kind of pull back and say, I'm only going to show my film in theater, that I'm not going to make it available via streaming. And if people want to see it, they can come to the theater and they can request a kind of a second showing, or they can see it when it comes out. So I think we can see a lot of different kind of outcomes depending on what audiences want, what producers are willing to try, and what the kind of middle people, the people that are bringing the movies like from the producer to the audience, what kinds of risks they're willing to take.
Yeah, Christopher Nolan comes to mind when you mentioned someone that might put a movie just in a theater. I don't know if he would ever do that, but
I can completely, because he might even make more money doing that. Like if he says, I'm only going to show in the theater, you get some art house cinemas that are willing to show his film, it might be a better deal for him than what Netflix could offer.
And he's relatively steered clear of certain technologies. I know, his Blu-rays don't usually come with Dolby Atmos. He loves IMAX, and larger scale, and that type of release really intrigues me. The thought of a blockbuster only. Yes. And not the one remaining blockbuster in Oregon, I think, but the actual theater. So I'm a huge fan of the theater. I like going for the spectacle of it, and as good as a home theater can be, I'm not spending $100,000 on a home theater to get the true movie experience, but a theater release only, and some sort of, not just, the popcorn or the hot dog or the beer or whatever you may have at the theater, but I could see more specialized theater houses, coming into existence, probably in larger metros more than small towns. But that's something I hadn't really put much thought into, and it's something that actually really excites me. So I'm glad that's something that we think could happen. We don't know. We're prognosticating here. I think I've asked you just about everything I need to ask. The only thing that really kind of crosses my mind now, and this is a little bit out of theater and more just into entertainment, you mentioned the difference between streaming and a movie experience. We went away from appointment television for a long time, and everything released all at once, if it was a TV show. Now we're seeing Disney Plus have success, with The Mandalorian as appointment television. You can watch the next day, but everybody watches on release day. We're reporting this interview on Friday, and WandaVision has its series or season finale tonight. This podcast will air on Saturday. But we're seeing, I think, a return to appointment television plus, I guess, since we're throwing plus on the end of everything now. Is that something you see that it could become appointment entertainment at home, whether it's, a TV series or a release, and a longer release pattern for, you would see movies in the theater for a month and a half, but could you see one of those? I use Christopher Nolan as an example, one of those Christopher Nolan movies being in the theater for 4, 5, 6 months and say, hey, go anytime.
Yeah. I think that's very, very possible. It again depends on what sort of model they're kind of running. And I think the kind of appointment TV that Disney Plus is doing is showing that just because you can do something, just because Disney could have very obviously have decided to release everything at once, doesn't mean that that's the best way to get it out there. And we've always seen the industry experiment, again, from running a single feature to a double feature, from doing a midnight show to having films start at 10 in the morning. There's all kinds of experimentation in terms of date and time. And the fact that I think the pandemic has kind of loosened that a bit. So now with HBO Max and Disney, they're no longer afraid to release something on streaming at the same time that it's in theaters. I think we could see potentially a lot more experimentation. Perhaps it's WandaVision. You can see it in Thursday in the theaters only for one day, Friday at home, and then it's only available for a week. And then you've kind of lost your chance for 3 months. And that would perhaps kind of goose revenue for Disney in the theater, and then also kind of make their audience a little bit more loyal than they would otherwise be. So there's lots of possibilities out there. And I don't think it's that the pandemic is going to fix the outcome in any way. And it might almost be that even if the pandemic had never happened, a lot of the trends that were already in the works would have still occurred, perhaps a little bit slower, perhaps somewhat differently. But I think we might be in the same place that we're going to be later this year.
All right. Dr. Johnson, thanks so much for joining me. This was great. You can get Main Street Movies on Amazon. Anywhere else that I can point everybody to?
Indiana University Press is the publisher, so you can get it from their website as well.
Perfect. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate you being here.
Great. Thanks again.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone at home for joining us. I hope today's conversation was as enlightening for you as it was for me. Please come back next week when I will be discussing more of the history we live through every day.